Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James. I run the foundation, but tonight I'm not going to do anything particular apart from just the sort of boring announcements. So that's the housekeeping announcements, and I will just introduce our chair today, and I'll leave it to him to introduce the two speakers. So it's Professor Steve Dodd, right next to me. He's Professor of Japanese Literature at SOAS, and lectures on various aspects of particularly modern Japanese literature, including women's writing. And I think I'll probably just leave it at that, Steve, and then hand over to you. So thank you very much.
So, hello everybody, good evening. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, just to confirm, I am Steve Dodd, and I'm a Professor of Japanese Literature at SOAS, and have great honour to chair the event this evening. So thanks very much to Daiwa for putting on the event, and especially for Shioko Ogawa-san, who's been involved in, as the programme director, been involved in putting the event together. And of course I'm delighted to be able to welcome the two main speakers this evening, Kanako Otsuji and Michael King. And they'll be speaking this evening, as you know, about sexual diversity in the UK and in Japan. And I think it'll be really interesting because obviously they're coming from very different angles, and it will be a kind of contrast, comparison, and seeing links and divergencies about what we mean by sexual identities, and in a sense that will just make things a kind of a rich mix. Now, before I will introduce them properly in a moment, but before doing so, let me just sketch out the schedule as I understand it for this evening. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks to try and put things in a little bit of context, and then Kanako first, and then Michael will give presentations of about 20 minutes each, and then we'll have, I know there's I'm sure you've all got lots of questions and responses you want to make, so we'll open up to question and answer, and we intend to finish something like 7:20, and then what you will be waiting for, there'll be a drinks reception, so please come along to that. So let me begin by making a few very general remarks about the area of sexual identities, particularly same-sex relations in the context of Japan. I mean, you might think, well, we've got someone who's talking about from a political angle, from a psychiatric angle. What's someone who is a professor of Japanese literature doing here? Well, there's a personal reason. I am gay. I've spent a lot of time in Japan. I've hung out in the bars in Nichome in Tokyo, in Japan for a long time. So I've got that, any personal interest, if you like. But and kind of related to that is the way I've done my studies over the year in terms of literature. And in particular, I have looked at the question of same-sex desire as it's being represented in Japanese literature, particularly modern Japanese literature. But very briefly, I realize it's not because I'm an academic, I could go on for all night, but I won't, I promise. Just to give you a little taste for those who are not familiar with the Japanese tradition of how same-sex desire fits into the Japanese culture. And very briefly, there's a long tradition, particularly of male same-sex relations. You won't be surprised to hear that there's very little documentation about what the girls got up to, but that's the same in most cultures. But certainly in Japanese culture, there was a strong tradition of male same-sex relations, especially between the 17th to the 19th centuries. This was a time, the so-called Edo period, the Tokugawa period, where there was a strong, you could say, a strong sort of samurai ethic was promoted, and so there was a strong male. It was a strongly male-centered society, and but if I say that there was a tradition of male sex activities that was represented in literature, in painting, in various on the stage, although this was quite prevalent, that's not to say that it was somehow some kind of, 1960s gay paradise where women and gay men stood up together and fought for equality. It wasn't like that at all. It was a very misogynistic society, you could say. So in a sense, in that male-centered society, sex might have not been a very good thing, but if you had to do it, well, at least you do it with the other guys rather than go too far with the girls. So there's a lot of misogyny there. So just to put a kind of counter to the idea that that some people have, that Japan was somehow some kind of gay fantasy world. But then, late 19th century, the West arrives, and this is a very typical story that we hear when the West arrives in other parts of the world, colonizing other parts of the world. The West arrives, and at that time there's obviously a very Victorian morality and an introduction into Japan of so-called civilized attitudes towards sexuality, and in particular the whole idea of same-sex relations became unmentionable, became one of those things that you shouldn't describe. But, and this is my interest in literature, the great thing about literature is all about giving space for those things that you shouldn't talk about to bubble up. So you do see things appearing in literature. And so, for instance, the most famous modern Japanese writer is Natsume Soseki, who was writing around the beginning of the 20th century, and his most famous book, it's a book called Kokoro. Most people don't know, but it's a great book if you want to read something about Japan. And it has one of the main themes is the relationship between a university professor and his student, and there's a strongly homoerotic side there. Now, for the last 100 years, most critics have never really talked about that. But in the last 20 years, say, people have begun to speak a lot more about that and pick up the concept of, or pick out the thread of homoeroticism in modern literature. And then perhaps many of us will already be familiar with someone from the middle of the century, just after World War II, Mishima Yukio, who wrote very, very clearly about homoeroticism. You see the pictures of him sort of greased up and posing with arrows poking his body and so on. But he's problematic because he ended up flirting with far-right groups, fascist groups, and then shockingly committed a harakiri. What my mum used to call it harikari. So cut his belly open in 1970. But then, even more recently, these are all, we're talking here about male same-sex relations, but even more recently, another writer who you may be familiar with from the 1980s, 1990s, woman writer, Yoshimoto Banana. Banana is a word she chose herself, which I think is it's kind of an interesting interesting word to hit on. She, in some of her short stories, she talks about lesbian relationships. And then her most famous novel is called Kitchen, and in that story, one of the main characters, as a young man, his mother is called Eriko, and it turns out his mother used to be his father, but she had a sex change. Now, we can't go into the details now, but all I'm saying is, despite the fact that in Japan you're not really supposed to talk about sexuality in this way, it does come up in society. It is there. And it needs to be addressed somewhere or another. So there's a lot to talk about from a literary perspective, but obviously the evening is an opportunity to hear about the theme of sexual diversity from two other angles. And the first person to mention is Kanako Otsuji, who's taken a clearly political path. And she's the Japanese LGBT rights activist and former member of the House of Councillors in the National Diet of Japan. She was also a member of the Osaka Prefectural Assembly, I think between 2003 and 2007. And I understand she was one of only 7 women in that assembly of 110 people. So it's not simply about same-sex relations or lesbian identity. It's about just being a woman in that society. And then between May and July 2013, Kanako was Japan's first openly lesbian member of the Diet after taking over the seat from a retiring member of the Assembly. And currently she's director of the LGBT Policy Information Center of Japan, which is based in Osaka. Second speaker is Michael King, who actually by chance, he tells us today, happens to be going away to Japan for the first time, I think next week, on a holiday. So I've told him already that when he comes back, we hope to hear him speaking fluent Japanese. So Michael is an expert in the field of psychiatry. He's professor of primary care psychiatry in the Division of Psychiatry at UCL, University College London, and is co-director of PRIMENT, an NIHR registered clinical trials unit. He's a psychiatric I was trying to prepare this. I'm not a scientist. I'm not used to these words. He's a psychiatric epidemiologist who has a particular interest in the design and conduct of randomized trials of complex mental health interventions in primary and secondary care. He studied, also particularly, he's studied the health and well-being of lesbian, gay and bisexual people for over 25 years. This has included research into AIDS and HIV, the mental health of LGBT people, the history of attempts to treat homosexuality, and the role of psychotherapists with LGBT people. So, like you, I'm very much looking forward to the talks, and can I ask Kanako first to come and give her a talk? Thank you.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Kanako Otsuji. I've come all the way from Osaka, Japan, and this is my first time to come to the UK. Yes. I'd like to thank the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak today. I'm very much been looking forward to being able to speak today. So, and this is my second time to speak in English. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself as a representative director of Policy Informatics Center of LGBT. I am currently working on various educational activities in enrich social understanding and awareness toward LGBT, as well as recommendations for LGBT policy in Japan. I am the only lesbian politician who has come out, and I was the only serving LGBT member of the National Diet of Japan to come out. For comparison, in the British general election held in May, the members of parliament who are LGBT make up 4.9% of the total. That's around 32 and out of 650 members, which is apparently the highest in the world. In 2003, I joined the Osaka Prefecture Assembly. Osaka has the third largest population in Japan, amounting to over 8,880,000. Behind that, all the Tokyo metropolitan and Kanagawa prefecture areas. I was an independent member of Assembly. I was only 28 at the time, the youngest and only one of 7 female members out of 112. I started my journey as a politician in 2003. The reason I became interested in politics was because of my sexuality. I was born in 1974. It was during university at the age of 22 when I came out to myself as a lesbian. At that time, the saying the word lesbian is public was thought to be peculiar. I was fortunate in that this was when the internet started to be widely used. There was a computer in the classroom at the university, and we could find out all sorts of information on the internet. And also the mobile phone was becoming popular. Thanks to this, I was able to get information to meet up with people like me. And by coming out to be myself and meeting other lesbians, I felt like I was able to have my own sentiment. Many of lesbians at this time were hiding the fact that they were a lesbian from their family, friends, and colleagues, even hiding that their real name. Only in lesbian bars and clubs would they let themselves be themselves. Outside of these walls, they were well and truly hiding their lesbian self. I started to question, why must we only liberate ourselves at these places of the night? Why don't we have a sense of self-affirmation, even though the process of coming out is so difficult? The issue isn't that they're a lesbian or gay. Rather, I would say it's because society doesn't view the homosexual as a human being. What I think needs to change is not oneself, but this society that outcasts homosexuality. I wanted to somehow change society. I wanted to create a society where anyone can be themselves. For that reason, I wanted to get involved in politics. In the 2003 election, it was very much debated in the office whether I should come out or not. In the end, it was decided that I don't come out, but we do, however, put forward and fight for LGBT political issues. We decided it was something to think about after being elected. In 2005, the Lesbian and Gay Parade was held in Tokyo, and I came out at the opening ceremony as part of my welcoming speech. Around the same time, I published my first book. My coming out was broadcast on TV and was featured in newspapers. People at the assembly and those from affiliated groups were confused. They couldn't understand why a politician would come out and why someone would reveal something so personal. I thought visibility was what was important. So, being an out and proud politician was something I could contribute to society. Okay. In 2005, there was still no openly gay or lesbian politicians. Of course, there was no who was out in the business world either. And there was only one transgender officer in the Setagaya War office in Tokyo, Aya Kamikawa. And now that I had come out, I decided it was a time to address issues on a national scale. In order to reform the legal system, my next aim was to become a member of the National Diet of Japan. I thought about running in the leading opposition party, the Democratic Party of Japan. This would require a lot of work. It took half a year in order for this to get official approval. There was a lot more opposition in the party than I had expected. I thought it would have only taken 3 months, but it took twice as long as that. It was finally approved 2 months before the upper house election. At the earliest, people usually have around 3 years to prepare. So as you can imagine, my starting point was very much delayed. The election was lost by about 300 280,000 votes. It was less than half of what I expected. During the election, I received assistance from many LGBT volunteers. However, most of them hadn't come out yet, so they didn't really have the means to drum up support for me. Members of the LGBT community are not able to come out, so I think that it's difficult for the public to be concerned about LGBT issues, which is why I think I wasn't as widely supported. I was highly disappointed about not gaining a seat in the election. Even in the LGBT community, there was some criticism toward me along the line of, "We are happy enough staying in the closet, so why doesn't she give it a rest?" I couldn't picture a future in politics as a lesbian who is out and proud. In 2012, a general election was held in December. Then came a request for me to run in the next lower house election, one of my colleagues at the assembly in Osaka. Sadly, I failed to gain a seat in the election. However, despite this, I continued my political activity in Osaka. Before the upper house election in 2013, the Democratic Party politician in the upper house resigned, wanting to run for a different party in the next election due to lack of increase in supporter for the party. In the line with his resignation, then I became a member of the House of Councillors. To everyone's surprise, I became the first member of the Diet who was open about their homosexualities. It has been 10 years since I came out, and I've survived in the politics for 10 years as a lesbian. Perhaps some of you may think Japan is somewhat strange. For example, kabuki, Japanese traditional performing art in which the actors are only male and play both the female and male roles. On the other hand, Takarazuka, an all-female ensemble who play both the female and male roles. Both of these are very popular in Japan. We could say it's an example of culture that is open-minded toward crossing gender boundaries. Danshoku or nanshoku culture, which literally means male colors, was widely practiced by priests and monks in the environment where women were prohibited. Their object of sexual desire was young boy. This is said to have been popular in the Heian period. Up until the Meiji Restoration, people were very laid back about sex, especially among men. However, in turn with westernization and modernization after the Meiji Restoration, homosexuality was then regarded as unorthodox. This relates to the Sodomy Law, introduced, which I will introduce on the next slide. Also, yaoi. Okay, I mistake the spell. Yaoi, not correct spell is Y-A-O-I. Yaoi. Okay, as you know. Also, yaoi comics are popular among girls. These are about love story involving only boys, popularized as boys' love, and yuri comics, which is opposite, depicting love stories between girls, known as girls' love. These comics sell very well in Japan. They are often written by amateurs who make up a large part of the comic book industry. Next, I will talk about LGBT and the law. There is a large gap between culture and the political system. In Japan, there is no civil partnership act for same-sex couples. So, of course, there is no same-sex marriage law. The Disability Discrimination Act was established in 2030. However, there is no comprehensive anti-discrimination law. As I mentioned before, Sodomy Law existed in the beginning of Meiji period. However, it was abolished within 10 years. Also, Japan was the first country in Asia to abolish sodomy laws. Many Japanese don't know this fact, or even know that the law existed. The Japanese gay liberation started in the 1990s. In the early 1990s was an incident at the youth hostel in Fuchu, in Tokyo. A group of gay men were refused accommodation by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government-run establishment. And the issue was taken to court. The court ruled against the Tokyo Metropolitan, stating they put this group of homosexuals at a disadvantage. This incident is well known in the legal world. A law was established A law was established allowing those who identify as transgender to legally change their gender. This was in 2004. It's known as the Act on Special Case in Handling Gender for People with Gender Identity Disorder. This is wrong name act. Yes. When changing your gender in Japan, there are strict requirements. You need to have undergone some of gender reassignment surgery, be single, be over the age of 20, have no children. However, in regard to having no children requirement, this was amended in 2008, allowing those with children to change their gender, providing the child is over the age of 20. Transgender people who don't want to undergo surgery and have children under the age of 20, therefore cannot change their gender. And in Japan, there's no civil partnership law for same-sex couples. One reason is that on Article 24 on the Constitution of Japan, it states that marriage is a mutual consent of both sexes. In 2014, a lesbian couple submitted an official document for marriage registration in Aomori, in the north of Japan. Inevitably, it was outlawed by the Article 24. Article 24 states that marriage shall be based only on the mutual consent of both sexes. Therefore, a marriage registration from same-sex couple could not be accepted. The Constitution of Japan exists to protect the individual rights of citizens. Many legal practitioners have raised the point that this Constitution is being used to restrict the rights of citizens. So the Legal Network for LGBT Rights make a request to the Japan Federation of Bar Association for Restoration Same-Sex Marriage. In 2015, the lesbian couple will once again submit a marriage registration request. However, this time we know that there is no procedural law from the Constitution. Also, there is no civil partnerships. What has been used a loophole in the adoption system. The adoption of adult can simply be done by submitting official document. Using the adoption system, a legal procedure creates a parent-child relationship. Therefore, issues such as inheritance between those not related by blood become easy to handle. Couples who seek such a kind of legal security as a family or those who foresee a bereavement are using the adoption system. From this year, some local governments have started to tackle this by issuing certificate to register as a same-sex couples. So far, this is only in Shibuya and Setagaya in Tokyo. In the Shibuya ward, the regulation issuing certificates to same-sex couples was passed for the first time in Japan easily this year in March. This is planned to be implemented from next month. In November, Setagaya ward also announced they would be issuing partnership certificates for same-sex couples. They are not legally binding. However, it's still great news. And an all-party LGBT forum was held at the Diet this year. Since the ruling party is conservative, it wasn't proactive as I would have liked. However, I'm hoping to encourage the enforcement of law against discrimination towards sexual identity and sexual orientation before the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo. This year has been a huge step for the LGBT movement in Japan since 1990. I will continue my work and strive for equality to eliminate discrimination towards the LGBT community. Okay, thank you for listening.
Yeah, I do. Right, well, thank you very much. Can you hear me down there? Yeah. Well, I'm not expert in Japan at all, except that I'm going there next week, as you heard me say. But I'm really here to talk about the nature of homophobia and discrimination against gay and lesbian and transgender, mainly gay and lesbian people is the nature of my talk. And but I will refer a little bit to Japan, but not in anything like the specialism of what we've just heard. So let's get going. You know, this is silly for this audience, isn't it? But just to rehearse, because there is confusion about what is homosexuality. It's obviously attraction and romantic and emotional, physical and fantasy, but we're often told that about 4 or 5% of people are gay or lesbian, but that's a very, or bisexual, it might swell the figure slightly, but it's a very political idea in some senses. And nature isn't cut at the joints like that, and there is a much more fluidity and continuity in this. And so a lot of people have same-sex responsiveness, but wouldn't see themselves as gay or lesbian. And that confuses people, as we'll come to in a wee minute. So what's homophobia? Well, it's pretty obvious. Again, it's stigma and discrimination against gay and lesbian and transgender people. And I include transgender here because there's the same sort of moral outrage against transgender people as there is against homosexual people. And what's important about it, and many of you won't be able to see these, I think, at the back, I'm not sure, but it can be severe within families. Like other isms, it creeps into, unlike other isms, it creeps into the family. So although ageism does to some extent, homophobia is a real problem often with young children, adolescents, and it creates great difficulties with parents who reject them. I had a patient recently whose mother, when he told her he was gay, ran upstairs and vomited, which is quite symbolic, really, isn't it? And then disappeared for 3 days. So you can imagine the impact on people who tell their parents in that way. But then it becomes internalized in this sense of shame that some people have, that actually there's something wrong with them. And as we've just heard, actually, what's wrong is society. But people bring this feeling into themselves and start blaming themselves for something, particularly for the reactions of other people. So where does this word homophobia come from? Because it's such an odd word. Well, it was used by a psychologist back in the 1970s, and it was literally used as a fear of gay people originally, because often people think it's an odd term. Phobia is generally something that we're excessively frightened of. And but what's really interesting was that he felt maybe it had something to do with the discriminators' fears of their own sexual feelings. And he called it homoerotophobia at the start, but the eroto bit got dropped, and it was homophobia we're left with. And I'll come back to that point because it's quite interesting and quite important. So has it always been with us? Well, homosexuality hasn't always been with us. The term turned up at the end of the 19th century in Europe, and prior to that, it was regarded as sin, debauchery, and other words like that, and generally sodomy rather than anything else. Gross indecency as a crime in Europe, or particularly in England, came at the end of the 19th century, and that was the one that Oscar Wilde first fell foul of. That meant any sexual contact between same-sex men. There's never been legislation, at least in England, or in very few countries, if any, in the world, about women. That's not a sign of dignity for women, that's a sign of their unnecessary nature in society, really, that they don't hold power. And I'll come back to that. Now, the greatest disapproval has been in the religious area, and that's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam particularly. Shinto is really silent about it, but that may be because of a lack of text, or because really it's been a Western concept in the sense of this term. But very few societies have tolerated or accepted homosexuality. We hear a lot about ancient Greece, but it was toleration in certain aristocratic groups rather than real acceptance in the way we think about it today. So I want to give you a few examples, and some of these are rather bleak, of what's happened in the 20th century. The most famous one is the Nazi example. This, many of you can't see at the back, but this was the extremely obsessive nature of the way people were labelled, undesirables. Juden, Jews are here, with the usual Star of David, and homosexuals are just here. And many people, and so you could, if you were a homosexual Jew, I'm afraid that was really the bottom of the pile. And you will see that the pink lambda symbol arose from the Nazis' persecution. Many people know that, but others are not always aware of what it is. And here it is here worn in these prisoners. And we know that many people died in the camps, far more people probably than these estimates show in Nazi Germany. This one looks like a holiday resort in the Canaries, if any of you have been to the Canaries. Unfortunately, it has less pleasant associations. This is South America, Chile, where at least 2 Chilean dictators have incarcerated mainly homosexual men again, and we're not really sure what happened to a lot of them. So what's today's temperature like in homophobia around the world? Well, it's pretty tepid in Western Europe, but not quite as tepid as you might think. And it warms up in Eastern Europe, particularly, as I'll come to in a minute, Russia and the Eastern European countries. It gets warmer as we get into India and China, and gets red hot in several Islamic countries. You'll notice Japan's not there, because Japan hardly ever figures in this, as we'll show you in a minute. This is a picture that went around the internet quite a lot some years ago. We forget really that nearly half the countries in the world, same-sex behaviour is illegal. Usually a criminal offence between men, and it's getting worse, as many of you will know, in the African states. It's moderated a little bit recently, but particularly Kenya, Uganda and Malawi were bringing in all sorts of draconian legislation. And two countries have recently brought in Mrs. Thatcher's wonderful idea of the 80s of stopping promotion of a pretended family lifestyle, I think she said, but it's propaganda is the word used there. And 8 countries still have the death penalty. I've included ISIL here. The Islamic group is not a country, but they're probably killing gay men at the highest rate of anyone at the moment. And these things are going on a daily basis. So what about Japan? Well, I won't say much about Japan because we've heard a wee bit about it, but there is a recent survey of attitudes to homosexuality in 2013, and Japan doesn't come out too badly. As we've just heard, there's no national anti-discrimination laws that protect people, and no laws that protect couples. So there's no legislation, as we've just heard, on marriage or civil partnerships. Of course, that's pretty new in our country too. But when we get down here, and there's a lot of heteronormative, as we say, assumptions. So a lot of gay people and lesbians end up marrying, having families because of the social pressure to do so. Again, what was a common pattern in Europe. But here, the attitudes, for those at the back who can't see, it's over 80% of people under 30 think that homosexuality should be accepted. I'm not quite sure, that sounds a bit like tolerated, but at least it's positive. And but 39% of people over 50 or more think so. So it's the usual, we just have to wait long enough for people to leave the stage, and then we get their attitude. So I want to now talk about much more subtle, but I think even more damaging examples of homophobia. And this was the 20th century recasting of homosexuality as an illness. As I said before the term homosexuality, we didn't really have something we could call an illness. And I think this one's also plagued with problems, is research into the origins of homosexuality. I'm not going to talk about that much, but I just examined a thesis yesterday about this. And I was surprised that the candidate hadn't thought maybe there was some ethical issues about the way homosexuality was viewed in that research. It seems to be the sort of pathological brother or sister of heterosexuality. Who's this? Anybody? I'm sure the English people all know. No, Alan Turing. Alan Turing is a famous example of someone who was originally treated with estrogens for his homosexuality. For people who don't know, he was a key code breaker in the Second World War in Europe, breaking the Nazis' codes, communication codes. He was an extremely intelligent man, probably the origin of the modern computer, but he was caught and prosecuted. He actually went and reported a theft when he had met a gay man who'd come back to his house. He was so innocent, he went along to the police and said, "Oh, I've been robbed." And they said, "Well, who by?" And then it turned out that it was a partner he'd had for the night, or longer actually. But so he was prosecuted, and he died by suicide. It's thought, it's not absolutely sure, after he was so upset by the disfigurement of his body after being on estrogens. So where did this come from? Well, these are a couple examples of famous sexologists in Europe who had the best of intentions, really. Their idea was that homosexuality was a biological variant of normal sexuality, and that if we could understand it in that way, and a bit like modern research about homosexuality, that the discrimination would die away. Well, it was very naive, because when you have something like that, immediately you think, well, how can I alter this biological variant? And there's been lots of attempts to alter the biological variant, starting back in the 1920s. These you can read about these papers in the at that time very highly rated German medical journals of testicular transplants between heterosexual and homosexual men. It seems without even the consent. I haven't any idea what the transplant surgery technology was like at that time, but certainly they were reported. But of course, psychoanalysis is the great offender here, and I hope I'm not offending any psychoanalysts, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But much of psychoanalysis was aimed in this field at making homosexual people heterosexual. And then we have the classic behaviorism. These were aversion shock treatments for people to reinforce attraction to women and punish or decrease attraction to men. And finally, we've got this modern variant, which I'll talk about in a minute, reparative therapy. It's a lovely term. So we wanted to see, and this is just a paper that we published in 2008, we wanted to see, well, given that history, what was happening in England at the moment? You know, were therapists trying to make homosexual people heterosexual? Well, it seems they were. We had a very big survey, and we got a high response rate to this, and only 4% of therapists, these were psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and people involved in therapy, and only 4% said that they would actually try to change. But another 10% said, well, if they couldn't do it, they'd refer it to somebody who could. I didn't know how they knew who it would be, but 1 in 6 people said that they had treated someone. So we asked them about that and got examples of that. Now, if your immediate reaction is to think, it's probably older therapists talking about what they did in the 80s, well, it wasn't, because we asked them, well, when did you treat these people? And it was at the same rate right up into the mid-noughties, the mid-2000s. So it was slightly worrying, and we weren't even sure what the therapy was. But why I bring this up at all is because I think this is one of the most stigmatizing things that can possibly happen to people. If your status, your personality, your way of being is considered an illness that needs treatment, and if your parents happen to look up the internet when you tell them you're gay, and here we've got a psychiatrist who can change that, this is a deeply homophobic thing to have in society. So what's happening now? Well, we have these reparative therapies that are mainly coming from religious groups across the world. Thankfully, they're declining a bit because they're losing respectability. But this is a very well-known site. It's called NARTH. It's the National Association for, I can't even read it there, for Behaviour and Research in Behaviour and Therapy of Homosexuality. It's a big group of psychologists who treat people to help them change. Now, these are often very distressed people. They've come from a religious background or family background that rejects their sexuality. And what happens to them? Well, the evidence, well, first of all, I think what's really interesting here is the word reparative. Because what's it repairing? And this comes directly from psychoanalysis, really. The idea that we have as Biber, who was a psychoanalyst in the 60s, said, in our view, every homosexual in reality is a latent heterosexual. Well, you may have heard about latent homosexuals, but now you hear about latent heterosexuals. So everybody's a latent heterosexual, and if we just do the right treatment, they'll become, homosexuals will become heterosexuals. And they can be returned to this substrate. This is deeply damaging because what actually happens? Well, the research is very poor. There's no randomized trial. That's what we would say is the gold standard of does a treatment work? There is none. There are some post hoc surveys. And this has alarmed people around the world to such an extent that in January this year we undertook what's called a memorandum of understanding between all the psychotherapy organisations in Britain. And this is the first time any subject has brought all the organisations together to declare, and there it can be found on the net, it's a consensus statement of all these organisations that these treatments are unethical, do not work, and are possibly damaging. The WHO is trying to take up a similar thing as therapy organisations in the United States. And I think it's very important for therapy organisations to put this out so that patients and families and even therapists can see that this is not mainline activity for any respected therapist. Okay, let me move on. And I'll just very quickly, before I stop, I want to talk about, well, what does it matter? What are the consequences of all these various forms of homophobia? And then I want to touch on some interesting research about what are the origins of homophobia. Why is it so universal? And we heard a wee bit about in the previous talk, this idea that people still feel great reluctance in any public position to declare themselves in a society like Japan. what are the consequences? Well, we undertook a systematic review of all the research that had been done up until 2008 around the world of mental health and attempts at suicide and deliberate self-harm in gay, lesbian and bisexual people, of all the work that's ever been published to date. And it doesn't make for very good reading. LGBT people have up to 4 times the rates of depression, anxiety, substance misuse, deliberate self-harm and suicide itself. Now, the suicide is a much harder one to judge because people don't always know if a young person who commits suicide might be homosexual because they may have said nothing, and that can be often the case. And we know now that psychosis, that's the severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, are also more common in gay and lesbian people, which is really quite frightening. And we know that all these disorders are subject to, environmental stress, that they're provoked by these things, particularly depression and anxiety. And we also know that if you adjust for these sorts of things in the research, if you take account of discrimination and bullying, some of this falls away. So a lot of it is related to the day-to-day discrimination. Now, this is in young people today across the world, not older people. Older gay and lesbian people of anything have better mental health than the younger ones. Now, that seems really odd because you'd think that as society gets more liberal and more accepting, that it would be the other way around. It might be that the older people are the survivors, that the older people have either, well, I don't want to say it, but it's not as bad as that, but have adapted and grown stronger with time, which is always the case with stress. But and the younger one. But the interesting thing is that the younger ones are still suffering. So something's going on out there, although it's all so accepting everywhere. One of the commonest causes of bullying in schools is still suspicion of being gay, not that whether you are or not. And it usually relates to what we call gender discordant behaviour. So boys who are a bit feminine or girls who are too masculine are called gay, whether or not they are or not. Talking about patients, I had a patient recently who all through his adolescence and 20s was bullied and discriminated for being gay when he was heterosexual. And he could never convince anybody he was heterosexual. Anything he did was just pretending he wasn't gay. It was really quite extraordinary. So it's that sort of behaviour that people are picking up on as much as the same-sex orientation. Well, why are societies homophobic? That's the Nobel Prize winning question, I suppose. Or rather, I would rephrase it, why generally are men homophobic? Because homophobia and sexism travel together. They're very closely linked. Everywhere you see homophobia, you see sexism, very strong sexism. The role of women is denigrated as well as the role of gays. Now, why might this be? Well, these are the usual reasons for homophobia. Disgust is a big area of research. I just find that area disgusting. Particularly anal sex, that really gets people into disgust mode. If you hear about it, it's always a thing that they focus on in terms of male homosexuality, forgetting quite easily that the rates, the prevalence of anal sex is very similar in heterosexuals and gay men. But that's blithely ignored. We've known that for a very long time. Many gay men do not ever have anal sex, and many heterosexuals have nothing but. So it's really quite extraordinary, but it's seen as a male homosexual thing. It's against God's law. Well, I've touched on that. It's corrupting. Now that's the Eastern European one at the moment. Contamination. That's what Putin is afraid of. That somehow people will go out and convince other people, or just by mere contact. We know that's not true. We know that men in prisons have sex with each other all the time and go straight back out to their girlfriends. It doesn't have any effect on them, and women similarly. And then maybe they're just a minority. It could be that people just don't like minorities. It could be an element of that. Or fear of femininity. And I think this is a big one here. Denigration of women. The idea that gay men in particular have given up their power and status as men and become sort of proxy women. And you see this across Latin America, that men who say they're more inclined to take the passive role in sexual intercourse with another man would have greater discrimination than someone who might consider themselves active. But this is a really interesting one, homoerotophobia. That's one that interests me, because that was suspected some time ago. And why is it in men? Now, heterosexual men appear to be quite interested in lesbian sex, but completely disgusted by male homosexual sex. So you can investigate this. And this is one study. It's a small study, but just to give you an example, it's quite interesting. And I'll go through it for people who can't see it. It's a student study where they took 35 homophobic students, male students, they're all heterosexual in arousal and experience, and they took 29 non-homophobic men. Now, you can measure this fairly readily with scales of attitudes and feelings about homosexuality. And then they linked them up to something I won't name because it's too difficult to pronounce, but it's an apparatus that measures the circumference of the penis and can tell when a man gets an erection. Okay, so it measures it on a strain gauge. And then the men were also asked to subjectively rate how sexy the video they were going to watch was. Now, the men didn't know the hypothesis here, and they didn't know which group they were in, and this was just measured before. So the 70-odd went through the study, and they were shown heterosexual, gay male, and lesbian sexual videotapes. Now, both groups of the men showed arousal, equal arousal, to the heterosexual and the lesbian videos. When it came to the gay male videos, the homophobic men, only the homophobic men, showed a significant increase in penile circumference, but they didn't subjectively rate the video as sexy. Okay, so something very strange is going on here, and this was quite easily shown in such a small sample. And these are difficult studies to set up, as you can imagine, but they have showed indirectly that this is the case as well. But here, what's interesting is what's going on here. Are the men really just dissimulating? Are they just lying that they see something attractive and they won't say it is, or that their penis doesn't lie? Or is it that they really don't know that at a conscious level? And that's perfectly possible. We know that arousal is not always a cognitive process, and particularly in women, arousal is not always linked to what they think of the situation, and vice versa. Men, it's much more closely linked. That's the trouble. So T-shirts like this are quite useful. Homophobia is so gay. Now, why I put this up is because people have used this research in education in schools. And people go into schools, and Peter Tatchell's used this quite often. If you've heard of him, he's a civil liberties man, promotes civil liberties and gay rights politically. And he uses this homophobia is so gay because if you go into the schools and say, well, research shows, that the bullies who bully gay people are actually turned on by it. And the head teachers say the bullying just stops. So it seems to be quite an effective thing to do. So I'll stop at this point, and I just want to sum up, because I've talked about almost anything but Japan, but I'm quite sure that all of this applies in Japan, perhaps even more rigorously than here, although thankfully there's much less legal sanction. And I didn't know at all that there was a sodomy law in Japan for 10 years. I'd always understood that there'd never been a law against, male-to-male sexual behaviour. But so I think homophobia is still alive. It's alive in many parts of the world, fatally in many parts of the world. And it demonstrates what kind of society we live in. And particularly the kind of medical aspects of this show tremendous discrimination at a level that people used to accept. And I think our example here tonight of a Japanese politician who's so open and visible is really the key, because I'm sure in the last 20 or 30 years, when someone's uncle or nephew or niece or grandmother is gay or lesbian, it makes a huge difference to public attitudes, and I think that's what's happened. But particularly in this country, I think legislation is obviously dead. And Cameron brought in gay marriage against considerable hostility, as we know. Amazing that a Tory leader did that. And but that's changed attitudes too. And I think that will go a long way to change mental health. Okay, thanks very much.